Welcome to the Indigo Podcast, an exploration of human flourishing at work and beyond. I'm Ben Barron of Indigo Anchor and Cleveland State University.
And I'm Chris Everett of Indigo Anchor. For more information, please visit us at www.indigopodcast.com. Hey everyone, so before we get started with today's episode, we just want to say, hey, thanks for listening.
Absolutely. You know, this podcast has been very successful. We just launched about 2 months ago, but we've gotten thousands of downloads. We have a diverse audience from around the United States and the world, and we've gotten lots of great feedback from people already. And it's just so encouraging to find that people have an interest in this idea of human flourishing and that the ideas that we're sharing here are resonating with folks. And, it's important for us to hear from folks. We really want to hear from more of you. We want to hear your ideas, your questions, your feedback, whatever you want to tell us or share with us. And you can do that easily by going to indigotogether.com/contact. Again, that's indigotogether.com/contact. We really want your help, and we need your help in spreading the word about what we're doing. We really consider all of you to be part of this Indigo Together community. And I think with all of you and with this podcast and the other types of things that we're doing here, I really think and we truly believe that we can make the world a better place through better leaders and better organizations. So just a quick plea to all of you to, engage with what we're doing, share what we're doing, and reach out to us.
Yeah. And for those shy people out there that think, wait a minute, other people reach in, other people might have more interesting things to say. We say hogwash. We want to hear from you. Yeah. So if you're a HR leader or manager out there or an individual navigating the corporate shenanigans, reach out. If something was helpful that we shared with you through one of our episodes, we really do like to get feedback from you. It's one of the highlights of our days. So we read everything that comes in and we look forward to hearing from more of you. It's been really great. So Ben, today's topic, which is part 2 of why people quit and how to keep them. What did we talk about last time, and what are we going to talk about today?
Yeah, so last time we talked about turnover and retention. We talked about what the research really tells us about all of this. And we talked about retention management, highlighting some evidence-based guidelines for people and organizations to keep the best people in their organizations and keep them from, voluntary turnover. That's when those good people leave the organization. And moving on to today, what we're going to talk about are really 2 topics. One is what we call the unfolding model of turnover, which is all about helping us understand the decision to leave an organization. What's going on psychologically with folks when they're making that decision? And then we're going to talk about this idea of organizational commitment and withdrawal from the organization.
Yeah. So let's just hop right into it, Ben. Unfolding model of turnover. This is such an important one to know about if you're not aware already.
It is. It's something that I think can help leaders and managers everywhere, because if we can understand the thought process, the psychological process that people tend to go through when they're thinking about leaving, then that can help us as leaders, as managers, to intervene in those situations and potentially help to keep some of the best people in our organizations. That's the idea here. So this unfolding model of turnover kind of goes back for a number of years, but it kind of goes, it really started with this idea that the decision to leave an organization historically and kind of intuitively, if I asked a bunch of people, why do people leave organizations? A lot of times people think, and historically we thought, that it was linked very closely with satisfaction, that if someone was dissatisfied or unsatisfied with their job, that they would leave. And,
myth, right?
That is a myth. It's not a direct connection between satisfaction and turnover. And one way you can think about this is, let's imagine that you have an organization with very, very low turnover. People just are not quitting from that organization. Can you automatically infer that the people are happy there, Chris?
No, absolutely not. Especially if you're the only factory in town
Yep.
and people aren't leaving, don't pat yourself on the back for being an excellent organization.
Number one employer. Right. Absolutely. That's right.
On a field of one, we're the
Yes,
best.
exactly. And conversely, if an organization has very high turnover, you have lots of people leaving on a regular basis, can you automatically infer that people are unhappy in that organization? What do you think, Chris?
Absolutely not. And
Right.
we see this all the time when we come into organizations as consultants. They're like, "Well, look at our turnover," as if that's some kind of pure litmus. It's
Mhm.
something you definitely want to track, but it can't be a factor in isolation.
Right. There are many different variables that come into the decision to leave an organization. And that's what this unfolding model of turnover is all about, because this connection between satisfaction and turnover is actually indirect. And this really stems from some great research that has been going on for a number of decades, really. And a lot, probably the primary researcher in this area, or one of the top researchers, kind of one of the fathers of this area of organizational science, is a professor named Thomas Lee out of the University of Washington, and he kind of started with this whole idea of why do people leave organizations, and has lots of research on this topic. And what it has really revealed is that there are five different paths or thought processes that can influence a person to leave, that a person goes through when they're thinking about quitting an organization. So before we kind of talk about those five different ways in which a person can think about leaving and actually leave, it's important to kind of get some definitions here, because there's some interesting concepts that can help us understand these paths. And the first one is what we call a shock, right? So this is kind of a trigger that a person can have that can make them start thinking a little bit differently about their experience in the organization. It can be something positive. It can be something that's kind of neutral, or it can be something negative, just something that happens to them either at work or at home. So if you think back to any times that you quit an organization, Chris, can you think of any shocks that you had?
Well, I mean, it was nothing like regularly finding a severed horse head at my desk or something.
Right.
Right. But yeah, there'd been some shocks. I had left some organizations that were pursuing ethically dubious methods for securing new financing customers.
Okay.
One organization was so this legally you had to read a script on, hey, we're setting you up for a credit card. And one of the methods they wanted to say is like, hey, we're just going to send this out and bill you for it. Then you would read the legal script for the financing option afterwards and just say, yeah, if you don't pay this right away, it's on credit. And they ended up getting sued for it. But, it was a shock to me that led me to leave, because it just wasn't an ethical way to deal with customers.
Right. So that's a negative shock for you. There can be many other types of shocks. So, for example, you may have an unsolicited job offer. You're not looking for a job. You're relatively, or at least you think you're relatively satisfied in your work and so forth. But out of the blue, you get a headhunter calling you. You get someone reaches out to you on LinkedIn and says, "Hey, have you ever thought about working at this, this type of organization, etc." So you get that unsolicited job offer. Maybe you have a change in your marital status. You get married, you get divorced, something happens, and that can start to make you think differently about your life and your career. Maybe your firm goes through a merger. I've seen this happen many times with a number of friends of mine, where the organization is acquired or merges with another, and that can certainly change things in the organization. Another one can be just a friend leaving the organization. This, because when we talk about this actually in part one of this topic, which, by the way, if you haven't listened to that one, I recommend that people go back and listen to it. But if you have somebody who you see as a friend, as a mentor, a coworker, just someone that you kind of like or respect, and they quit. That can be a shock.
Yeah. And, some of the change, you get a new boss, your manager takes a promotion, goes to another part of the organization, and maybe you get a junior yo-yo in there. And you're like, I don't know if this is going to work. Or, one of the things is, when I deployed to Afghanistan, I was like, wait a minute. What if I don't care about this whole swath of my life? Why am I doing these things? And you just start to reevaluate, right? So the shock doesn't have to be, the severed horse head at your desk every day. The shock can be, benign. It's enough to kind of blast your mind into that thought realm, something disturbing in your environment, right?
Right. And it could be something, again, positive, neutral, or negative. So that's a shock. Another concept that we need to think about is this idea of a script, which is probably not super common among most people when they think about their careers, but this would be a pre-existing plan of action. This is kind of an if-then type of scenario. If this happens, then I'm going to do something about it. In terms of my commitment towards the organization, I'm going to quit. I'm going to look for a promotion, those kinds of things. So shocks, scripts. And then there's search activities. These are all of those different things that we do when we are looking for and evaluating our career options. So this would involve brushing up your LinkedIn profile. This could be talking to friends and people in your network about opportunities that might be a good fit for you. It could be actually searching for jobs, actually starting to apply for jobs. So that's an important part of this as well. And then the last part is what we call evaluation. And evaluation is about the thought process that you go through when you're thinking, okay, well, am I really satisfied here? How committed am I to this organization? Why am I staying here? Is this job or is this organization really a good fit for me? Right? So we have the shock, the script, the search, and the evaluation. And these are all components of pretty much in some way or another, most of our decisions voluntarily to leave an organization.
So, you go through these motions almost intuitively, and it took a researcher like Thomas Lee to kind of say, okay, let's kind of map these out as a decision tree. So there's 5 main pathways that he talks about using these elements that are mixed up. And it's interesting. The first 3 begin with shock. And then, we'll say the last 2 start with evaluation. So, Ben, let's go through a few of these for our listeners.
Sure. So the first one is relatively simple. And this is where you experience a shock. You have this pre-existing plan of action or a script, and then you leave, right? So maybe you already are thinking that, hey, if my friend or my mentor leaves and goes to this other firm, you know what? I'm going to leave and I'm going to follow that person to the other firm. And, then it happens. And then you make that decision and you go. So that's the shock, script, leave type of scenario. That's not really as common as number 2, which is you experience some sort of shock. Something happens in your environment, either at work or at home, and it causes you to start thinking. Maybe let's take that example of a person leaving. Your friend leaves the organization, and then you're like, am I really satisfied here? Do I really fit in this organization? Is this the best that I can do? And then you start searching. You're like, all right, I'm going to start testing the waters. I'm going to look for some possible opportunities. Then I maybe get an offer, and then I leave the organization. And, the research tends to suggest that this is actually the most common path where you have this shock, you start evaluating your situation, you start searching, you get a likely offer, and then you leave. What's a little bit less likely is that you experience that shock, and then you just start evaluating, and then you leave before you even have some sort of offer. I guess if it was really bad at the organization, you might do that, right?
Right. But not all of us are just like rolling in massive amounts of cash. So, that's kind of the trust fund bail, right? I guess I'm going to go hang out with my parents in Malibu.
Exactly. Right. Yeah. I'll be thinking about that when I actually drive through Malibu on Thursday. I'll be out there. Interesting. So it's like, yeah, you that's a little bit less common where you just kind of have this shock, you evaluate, and you leave. You may also maybe even don't experience a shock. You just, for some reason, start thinking, and this happens over time. That's why this is called the unfolding model of turnover. Over time, you just start evaluating your commitment to the organization, your fit, your satisfaction. Then you start searching. Then maybe you get a likely offer, and then you leave. So you don't necessarily have to have that shock come up front. And then the last one, which is probably also not as common. This is also probably one of those trust fund situations where maybe you just start thinking about whether or not you like it there, and then you leave if you don't. So most of us don't have those types of options with regard to our employment. But maybe if you do, you just start thinking, you know what, I don't really like it here. I quit.
And I see this a lot in kind of end of the work life cycle executives. Maybe they flunked retirement once, or twice. Seasoned healthcare exec that comes in and decides to help a struggling organization for a bit. Maybe the situation with the board of directors or other execs changes, or okay, well, looks like this org's on the right footing now. I'm going to bow out. So
sure,
yeah.
Yeah. Well, and this might be, also some people just act rashly, right? If they experience something at work they don't like, and then they go. But that's probably not the most advisable path for most folks. But again, most people go through the path number 2, which is experiencing some sort of shock, evaluating their situation, start searching, start to, maybe get an offer, and then they leave. So that's the unfolding model of turnover, which helps us understand psychologically what's going on with folks when they're making the decision to leave an organization voluntarily.
Right. And just like pro tip for people that might not be aware, don't conduct this job search at work. Coming out of a technology background, we kind of have these things. How often is this guy, crawling Indeed.com or Glassdoor, that kind of thing?
Right. So probably a good idea to keep that something that you do off the network and maybe off your hours as well, right?
Do that. Yeah, cruise that on your cell phone, right?
That's right. Okay, so if that's the model, then it's important for us to think about what are some implications of that model for leaders and for managers and organizations. And I think one of the biggest ones is just understanding that turnover decisions are actually fairly complex. And there are a number of variables both within and outside of the control of the organization. So you're not going to be able to influence every single turnover decision. You still will have good people leave, even if you do all of the retention management strategies that we talked about in our part 1 of this episode. So keep that in mind. Now, some of those external predictors of turnover, things like the job market, things like the economy, those are pretty important predictors of whether or not people are going to leave.
Yeah, the business cycle plays a big part. So,
right.
When times are good and unemployment is very low, people have more openings to kind of navigate the work environment and broader workspace, making that critical leap from manager to director, or, those types of items. Recruiters are a lot more active in that part of the business cycle.
Sure.
But when the business cycle is low, everybody braces themselves. Time to hunker down. Really should be thinking twice about making some job changes if you're not a trust funder at that point in the business cycle, right?
Right. And that's because our perceptions of our alternatives are very important. If I don't think that I have alternatives, then you know what? I'm going to stick around, especially if I have people other than me depending on my income. I will suck it up and I will deal with this crappy job because, it's the best thing I've got right now. But I think it's also important to think about some implications in terms of reducing voluntary turnover from this unfolding model. And I think one of the bigger ones is trying to anticipate some of the shocks that can happen and having some appropriate and timely responses to them. So, think about, for example, if you are going through a merger or acquisition, that can be a very uncertain, turbulent type of time for any employee going through that situation, because it automatically, oftentimes makes people think about, well, is my job going to be eliminated? We have, now 2 HR departments and 2 accounting functions. Do they really need all of them? All that kind of stuff. And so think about those shocks, trying to have some appropriate timely responses. If you are in a job environment like we are right now, where unemployment is very low and there's a lot of people who are employed, openings are hard to fill, executive recruiters are calling, think about, hey, well, what should we be thinking about when and what should we tell our people? Like, what if they are contacted by executive recruiters, right? Is that something that we should talk about with folks? Hey, if you are contacted, that's fine. That's the way the world works. Let us know, and we want, because we really do want to keep our best people, or other types of responses to those situations.
Yeah, it's really important. Well, 2 things. One, it's really important that organizations calibrate themselves and say, are we the way we want to be? So this is a time to look at, we have these aspirational mission statements and value statements and things like that. How are we doing living up to our values? Mm-hmm. And then our processes in HR and manager training and all of those items that go into why somebody would experience a shock or just start evaluating their options. Are we calibrated to be the organization we want to be? So if somebody does leave, we can honestly say there's nothing that we would want to change about ourselves. We are very proud about who we are. Mm-hmm. That requires some self-reflection as an organization that I think should be institutional. Like maybe twice a year, you're really taking a look at that, or maybe you have some kind of assessments that helps you evaluate that stuff on an ongoing basis. So if you have that dialed in, no matter where you are in the business cycle, no matter what's going on, you don't have to sweat all of these. Do we really have a good handle on turnover and what's going on here? Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And the second item is, if you're an individual looking for a job, be aware of the shocks. Like Ben, you were talking about, just be thinking about those things. So if you're new, entering Generation Z or something like that, entering the workforce, just know it's not all unicorns and rainbows out there, right? Be aware that people are jerks, and that these organizations are made up of imperfect people and have different levels of maturity. That's something you can evaluate with your friends or other people that work in an organization. If you know anybody, hey, how are they doing? Glassdoor.com can help give you a sense of what kind of org to help prep you for those things. Develop some personal resilience on those shocks. And then if you're a senior level executive stepping into a crucial role, and I just think, this is different places for different organization, but one of those things is when you go from, say, senior manager to director, you got to be super careful if you're doing that very late in the business cycle. Be aware that you need a couple years in that executive role to solidify your experience as staying at that role. Mm-hmm. But other companies, if you this is where we talk about job market and economy are important predictors. If it's 4 months before an impending economic crisis, which we never know that well, but if it's late in the game, just be really aware of how certain that shift is going to be late in the economic cycle, and will you have enough time to solidify your place in that role?
That's really, really well said. And I think just going back to your idea of being resilient, especially if you're early in your career, realizing that there are people who are, no job is perfect. I, for example, I love my professor job, but I really don't like grading. Like, it's just not very fun. There are other. I much prefer being in front of a class and teaching and so forth, as well as doing some research and writing, all that kind of stuff. But there are parts of every job that are not great. So you need to have a realistic outlook on the workplace and realize that, hey, you're going to have to put up with some stuff as an employee, really at any level. And so, don't get disheartened when the first bad thing happens to you, or you experience a bad boss, or even if you're in a role that you really don't like and you have a bad boss. If you are in an organization that is large enough, you need to have kind of the awareness and the big picture mindset that, what, I may not like this boss, I may not like this part of this organization, but this is a big company and there are a lot of opportunities elsewhere. So maybe you just need to find a mentor and go network a little bit and find those other opportunities. And I think directly back to my experiences actually in the United States Navy. Early on in my career, I had some great experiences. I had some not so great experiences with people with different roles and so forth. And I'm really glad that I stuck it out and have made it into the reserve component and have been able to do stuff that I really am a good fit for and really enjoy doing. But I wouldn't have been able to do that if I would have just, called it completely quits at the first sign of not liking things. And I was ready to do that. But I had some people who were like, hey, give this a shot. It's a big Navy and you have a lot to offer, that kind of stuff. So I think that perspective is really good, especially for our early career folks.
Yeah, and it's just realize it's a jungle out there. And so, if you live in a village in the middle of the jungle, you don't get really hacked off that there's tigers and stuff that can eat you out in the jungle. Right? You're just like, well, I live in the freaking jungle. There's tigers, and I know everybody says lion, tigers, and bears, but are there really bears?
I don't think bears really go with that. Yeah.
Yeah, maybe there's a listener out there that knows, do bears live in jungles? But so maybe pandas or something, right?
Yeah, maybe.
Anyway, you live in the jungle, right? You're in the corporate jungle. You're in the work world jungle. There's lions and tigers and bears and stuff out there. So just like the guy in the village or girl that is out there, they don't get mad about it. They just accept that as part of the environment. So take this knowledge and leverage that for yourself so you can navigate the jungle better.
That's right.
Don't have that. You don't have to be emotionally infected by just the garbage that goes on, right? You
Right.
can navigate that place well.
Yes, you can. Another implication of this unfolding model for organizations is remembering that you as a manager, and this is something we talked about in part one of this episode, you as a manager do have a large influence and can directly influence things like, people's satisfaction, people's commitment to the organization. Being a great supervisor can positively influence that evaluation phase of the unfolding model. So let's say someone has that shock where a friend leaves or whatever happens, and then they start thinking about their job. If they come back and say, well, you know what? This organization is awesome because they really care about me as a person. They really value my contributions. My supervisor helps me and shows that same type of dignity and respect and so forth. That's really going to help. Right. It is very important to think about things like, having adequate pay, having a good work environment, colleagues and coworkers who are nice to each other and, getting in front of some of those issues of incivility and so forth. So having a good culture and good work environment is important because of that evaluation phase that people go through when they're thinking about leaving.
Right. And this is where if you're an HR professional, and I'm always surprised to still see this, like here's an example. I have a friend of mine that he's an engineer in DC. Well, he does a lot of math stuff, but his training was as an engineer. And he was in an organization that hired him before he was awarded his PhD. So he was wrapping up his research. He had to defend, that kind of thing. And, they had mentioned that, hey, we pay our PhDs X. And he said, great. So when I get my PhD, will I be bumped up in pay? And the HR people had said, yeah. And so he gets his PhD. He's happy where he's working. And then he sends his email, what do I got to do? And they're like, oh, we don't do that. well, wait a minute. What about these emails? And they're like, oh, no, we can't do that. That's, not our policy.
Oh,
Maybe
yikes.
I know. And so now he's stuck in a place where he can't ever catch up to his peers.
Right.
So he's got a PhD. And that was a shock to say. He talked to his boss who said, yeah, you're right. So let's talk to HR and then my boss's boss. And it totally got thrown down. And so he had structurally, there was something messed up in this organization that was causing him, and I'm sure there's others, to just leave. And so, he got out on the job market. He's making like a lot more money elsewhere. And, during his retention interview, well, why are you leaving? How obtuse, right? So if you're in HR, like you don't know what your lower level managers or maybe even some of, you better know what your own HR staff are doing, right? But there can be these structural elements and you need to evaluate those to make sure that people aren't getting off the bandwagon for stupid reasons that are completely avoidable.
Right. That's a good example and a sad one, right? So that's the unfolding model of turnover. I think we can move now to talk about these ideas of organizational commitment and what we call withdrawal behaviors in organizations.
Right. And this is about what can organizations do to get their arms around the turnover monster and increase commitment to your organization. The hiring, onboarding, retaining, that takes so much organizational time. I really recommend you try to make that be as small of a piece of your time pie as you can.
And also making it something that's very high quality. You want to have a good experience for folks after you hire them. And a couple of things that we can talk about, I think, that are important with regard to organizational commitment and withdrawal before we kind of define those things is, we've talked about in prior episodes, we've talked about this idea of perceived organizational support, which is, a psychological construct, so to speak, that is and has been really well substantiated by decades of research to be this engine for a lot of these different things around our attitudes and perceptions of the organization. So when we feel like our work organization values our contributions and cares about our well-being, those are the two components, valuing our contributions and caring about our well-being, we are much more likely to reciprocate those positive feelings back to the organization through higher performance, and most notably and most relevant to this episode in terms of organizational commitment, which is, an attachment to the organization, an intent to remain part of the organization. Because you start to feel like this felt obligation, that, hey, the organization really cares about me. I feel obligated to stick around. And so that's a really important thing to consider. And a big part of that is making sure you have fair policies and procedures. In the example of your friend who got his PhD and didn't get the pay raise that he expected, that was a complete violation of his sense of fairness. And it's not surprising at all to me that he would then, start to go through this evaluation phase and his organizational commitment would start to rapidly decline. And so having good supervisors, having good policies and procedures that are perceived as fair, as well as, having good rewards and job conditions that make people feel like they're valued and supported. That's a really important part of this whole piece.
Right. Because it's so important, this perceived organizational support. It just briefly lists those two items again, Ben.
Right. So in terms of the predictors of perceived organizational support, the first one is perceived supervisor support. Right. So if I think my supervisor really values my contributions and cares about my well-being, then I'm likely to attribute that to the organization. So having supportive supervisors, that's number one. Number two is perceptions of fairness. Making sure that your policies and procedures are fair, the way that people are treated is not only objectively fair, but also subjectively fair. People have to believe that it's fair in terms of how they're being treated with dignity and respect. And then actually there's a third piece, which is what we call organizational rewards and job conditions. So, making sure that you have adequate pay in place, good benefits in place, having a decent work environment for folks. All of those things are important as well.
And then I want to add this piece. You can't fake this stuff. And I
Right.
say this all the time. If you are an exec or like part of the organization that's in charge of these kinds of things, maybe corporate training, HR, whatever, if you're like, what is the minimum I can do to make these people feel like I give a rip?
Yeah.
That's your red flag that you need to go, I don't know, on a yoga retreat and think about stuff, because you're just on the wrong side of the equation, man.
Right. Yeah.
Places where we see, favoritism. I hired my cronies,
Oh my God.
all of these kinds of ideas. These are the things that cause organizations to be so just to be garbage. We say massively sub-optimized or some, consultant speak, but you stink if you're trying to fake this stuff. And that's a personal question you got to go through as an individual and as an exec. And there could be stuff like, there's sociopaths right out in the workplace. That's one of the tigers that you see. Being able to evaluate for some of that and looking for those kinds of behavior. If you're head of HR and you're empowered, you got to raise the red flag for those things, because perceived organizational support is like one of the daggone pillars for being a place that's worth working at. Right?
It really is. It really is. And, you might be able to trick people for a very short period of time. It's like, oh, well, we're going to institute, casual Fridays and free beer in the fridge or whatever and stuff like that, and think that people are going to feel like they're cared about. Maybe that'll work for a week or a month or something. But if you are still treating people like as a jerk, if you're, have these policies and procedures in place that show favoritism, it's just not going to cut it. It's just not. And like you said, this comes back to some of these big questions about how you as a leader are going to live your life. Do you want to be a person who has integrity and values that support these types of things or not? And you know what? There are plenty of people who actually do, okay, and can fake it and, be a train wreck in an organization, make some decent money, and then leave. But for me, I always think about the wake of destruction interpersonally and organizationally that these people leave, as well as, what do you really want when you're old and you're looking back and, thinking like, what are people saying about me? How do they remember me? It's just fairly unpleasant to think about the fact that, I don't really want people thinking, oh, well, that person was a jerk and was super selfish to the end. Like maybe that's just me, but I think that's something that leaders need to be thinking about when they are structuring their organizations, when they're deciding how they're going to operate.
Right. And you see some of this from kind of the cutthroat organizations, the old Jack Welch approach of, the bottom 2% out or whatever. If your organization's set up for kill or be killed, people are going to come up a certain way, and that's going to self-select certain types of managers that are going to behave in certain ways. And then, you've just created this really garbage kind of culture that just becomes cutthroat, right? And those kinds of things. So won't get totally deep into that, but if you need to curate the kind of culture you want, and perceived organizational support will not support certain cultures.
Right. So we talked about this other idea of job embeddedness in our prior episode in part 1. So I won't delve into it too deeply, but it's important to remember that people are not only part of your organization, but they're also embedded in a larger community. And to the degree that you can support people in that endeavor, the more they're going to be likely to at least stay in that geographical area. So that's another thing to consider. But now I think we can turn our attention to these ideas of organizational commitment. We've mentioned this a couple times in this episode already, but just the general definition of organizational commitment is that this is about a person's intent to remain part of the organization. And whether, so if you're very low in organizational commitment, then that probably means you're starting to engage in some search behaviors, you're looking for other jobs and so forth. So it's your intention to remain part of the organization. But there are 3 types of organizational commitments that we generally think about. And these have important distinctions among them. So the first one is what we call affective organizational commitment. And affective organizational commitment has to do with how people feel, right? How they emotionally respond to the organization. And if you have a high level of affective organizational commitment, this means that you remain part of the organization because you want to, right? Because you want to. That's different from normative organizational commitment, which is I stay part of the organization because I ought to, because I feel obligated to be here. If I leave, the organization's going to fall apart. I don't really want to be here, but I feel like I have to be here. I ought to be here. And then continuance commitment is I am still part of this organization because I have to, right? It's not that I feel like I ought to, it's just that I have to because I either, one, perceive that I have few alternatives elsewhere, or number two, there's going to be huge sacrifice in leaving the organization. This is maybe you have some sort of awesome retirement plan or some sort of golden handcuffs that are keeping you part of that organization. You feel like you have to stick around. That's continuance commitment.
Yeah, you signed a 10-year Army contract and 3 years and you decide you want to be a Broadway star or something like that, right?
Yeah, that's probably not going to work too well. But that would be continuance commitment. So affective, you want to be there. Normative, you feel like you ought to be there. And continuance, you feel like you have to be there. Now, out of those, Chris, which ones do you think you would want your people to have if you're a leader as a manager?
Well, obviously you want, the affective, right?
Yeah.
Which is, similar to the word affection, if you need help remembering it. But you want that. And so you got to ask yourself, am I generating that place that people love and want to be at?
Right, exactly. So we want to generate that type of loyalty, that type of commitment to the organization. And there are some things that we can actually watch out for that can help us give an indication to the idea that people maybe are kind of low in their commitment. And these are things that we call withdrawal behaviors.
And it's not like withdrawal, like you're so addicted to your job when you're not there, you feel withdrawal symptoms.
No, not at all. Not at all. These are things that people do to avoid the work situation. These are either psychological or actual physical things they do to avoid either thinking about or being at work. And, the ultimate kind of culmination of this is quitting the organization. It's that voluntary turnover piece. So a way to think about this is that when withdrawal behaviors are high, when people are doing a lot of these things that we're going to talk about, then organizational commitment is typically low. And vice versa. When organizational commitment is high, people tend to have fewer of these withdrawal behaviors.
Right. So let's talk about them. I mean, these are situations where, and it's not necessarily the company's bad all the time. It just may be a bad fit for you, right? But an individual's psyche will start to do stuff to cope with the environment that they're in. And, one of the first ones, daydreaming.
Right. So this is the first big bucket is psychological withdrawal. And so you can daydream, I always think back, we already referenced the movie Office Space in part 1 of this episode, so we have to do it in part 2 as well. But this is where, they ask this one guy, they say, describe your typical day. And he says, I usually show up late. I come in the back door so my boss can't see me. And I get to my desk and then I just kind of space out for a while. And, the consultants who are asking him this question are like all confused, like space out. He's like, yeah, it looks like I'm working, but I'm just kind of staring at my screen. And, and it's so funny because it's true, when we are not feeling committed to our organization, sometimes we will maybe kind of just sit there and think about other stuff and just, really start to psychologically detach ourselves from that organization, start to withdraw and, think about other stuff that we possibly could be doing, maybe thinking about, other possible jobs. Who knows, right? But daydreaming is part of this psychological withdrawal.
I was at this one, it was my first cubicle farm job. And early in my career, I'm just individual contributor. And I remember just, I hate lawn care, right? I mean, especially, I'm living in Nashville, Tennessee at the time. And in the summers, it is just hot and humid,
brutal.
right? So, but I remember sitting in this cubicle farm, and everything's sterile. And I'm looking at the guys doing the lawn. And I was like, it'd be great if maybe 2 days a week, I'd rather be cutting lawn with these guys. I bet you they don't have to report to anybody. They just, put on their headphones and mow the lawn.
That's right.
So, yeah, definitely. It's bad if I'm dreaming about doing lawn care, right?
Yes, that's true. So hopefully during this podcast, you're not dreaming about mowing the grass. Another one is socializing. And, this isn't a bad thing necessarily, people just like talking to each other and so forth, but it can be a form of withdrawal from the organization because it's like, I don't really want to work. So I'm going to just kind of poke my head over to the other cube and like talk to this person. I had a coworker once who would always stop by my office and discuss various medical issues that she was having. And, as a form of socializing, but it was actually kind of gross and annoying to me because I was not withdrawn from my job. I was trying to do my job, and I didn't really want to hear about her tooth abscess.
Oh my gosh! Yeah, that's like. Yeah, don't talk about tooth abscesses at work. That's pro tip there.
There you go. Career tip. So socializing at work, that can be a form of psychological withdrawal because you don't want to pay attention to what you're doing in terms of your job. You're actually trying to just talk to folks about what's going on. I'm not saying here that you shouldn't be friendly to people. Like, go ahead and do that. But this can be an indicator that people are withdrawing a little bit psychologically. Another one is looking busy. In certain jobs, it's fairly easy to do this. I remember having some jobs where I became a master of this actually, where if I just walked quickly and had something that I could write upon in my hands, I mean, I would get assigned less work. People would think that I was a go-getter, but I was just actually kind of walking quickly and getting a little exercise.
And this happens in orgs and like companies need to be aware of this. And lots of times they don't care. If you're not in a super lean, hyper competitive environment, that there's a lot of this kind of, I've seen it. I had a young person who entered the workplace and I'm like, these people literally talk 2 to 3 hours a day. So they've got the socializing thing. And then the rest of the time they're on Facebook or some kind of garbage, right?
Right.
And maybe they do an hour and a half. Why can I never find these jobs? I mean, because I'd hate them, but they do an hour and a half of real work. And so there's a structural problem that your management doesn't know what's going on. They're asleep at the wheel, but they may be socializing and looking busy themselves.
Very true. And you just mentioned, poking around at Facebook while you're at work. That's actually falls in a category of something that we call cyber loafing. So this is the idea that
I just love that word. Come on.
I do too. I do. It's one of my favorites. So this is, hey, I should be working on this spreadsheet or responding to these emails or whatever. But actually, I'm going to shop for shoes, or
my fantasy football league needs attention.
Right. So that's cyber loafing. And another one that we could consider psychological withdrawal, and maybe in some ways it could be a little bit of physical withdrawal, but this would be moonlighting. So this is, doing other work for, working on your freelance business or whatever while you're at the other job. And, most organizations have some sort of policy about these things, and it's okay usually if it's not interfering with your work. But if it is, then that is definitely a form of withdrawal. And you could even consider, if someone is doing more and more of that, even in off work hours, that may not be a violation of policy, but it is a sign that the person perhaps is psychologically withdrawn somewhat from the organization. And these are things that these psychological withdrawal facets, these elements, are things that you may or may not be able to notice as a manager. I can't really know necessarily if I'm looking at someone, if they're, especially if I'm not paying attention for a long time, I may not know that they're daydreaming, right? Now, if I could probably know if they're cyber loafing, if they're doing other stuff. But some of these you maybe will notice, some you may not. But they are all parts of this kind of withdrawal from the organization to some degree.
Yeah. And so if you're seeing people, clicking around, you see a lot of socializing and stuff. My preferred recommendation for executives that I'm coaching is, yeah, don't go, hey, quit, you know, shooting, chewing the fat, for
Hmm.
3 hours a day. You need to say, what can I do and change about this person's work environment or how we operate as a team or the kind of vision that I'm catching to actually bring the engagement around. I don't see a lot of success directly confronting the behavior unless you've tried that first part, right?
Right, right. And that's kind of a compliance versus engagement model. What you described in terms of directly, hey, stop clicking around on Facebook. That is more of a compliance model, right? The engagement model would be more around, I want to make work so engaging and attractive that they're not even thinking about all this other stuff. I want, to create a work environment that is really a high performance one versus something that's just boring.
Right. Or if it is boring, because some jobs just are. You just
True.
have some stuff you got to do. There's different things you can do, but I definitely commitment is what you want rather than compliance. So let's talk. So those are psychological factors. Now they're actual physical factors. Now these are things you can actually notice more easily than the psychological withdrawal symptoms.
For sure, for sure. So one of them is tardiness, just showing up late. Happens once, okay, but if it starts to become a trend, that could be an indicator of physical withdrawal from the organization. One that I notice sometimes is the long breaks. When the when the lunch hour turns into the lunch 2 hours, and or someone takes a lot of time doing whatever. It could be it's not as common anymore, but it could be smoking or whatever types of break people are taking. If they're doing that for a very long period of time, that is physical withdrawal.
Right. So you have your morning coffee hour, your lunch 2 hours, and then your afternoon coffee hour.
Yes. Yes. So basically that's like half the day.
Right. Perfect.
Right. Exactly. So another one could be missing meetings. Um, I'm reminded of Office Space again, where he says, looks like you've been missing a lot of work lately. I wouldn't say I've been missing them, Bob. Right. But, so people may be skipping meetings. They may not come into work. Right. So absenteeism. And this all leads up to the ultimate form of physical withdrawal, which is quitting your job.
Right. And if your meetings are garbage, people should miss them.
Yeah. Yeah.
You got to fix those things, right?
Right. Right. Imagine how many meetings would get fixed if, people, there was like a cultural norm where people would come into a meeting, and if it didn't start going well in the first 5 minutes, they would just all stand up and walk out.
Oh, man.
That'd be interesting, right?
Be awesome.
Yeah, it would. It would. Awesome. Cool. So we've talked about these, these different types of commitment. You really want affective organizational commitment where people want to be part of the organization. Some of these different withdrawal behaviors that you can look out for, particularly looking out for those physical ones, because the psychological ones are a little bit tougher to notice, without being super intrusive. But we're looking out for those physical withdrawal behaviors because those could be indicators, and likely are indicators, of low organizational commitment.
Yeah. So Ben, let's wrap up. Well, so and let's talk about part 1 and 2, because this is a 2-part series. So
It is.
in part 1, we talked about turnover retention and exactly what the research says.
Right.
We talked about retention management. What are some evidence-based guidelines? And then today we talked about
The unfolding model of turnover to help us understand that psychological process that people go through when they're thinking about leaving an organization, and some implications of that model for how leaders and managers and organizations can intervene and maybe influence those decisions in a positive direction. And then we talked about these ideas of organizational commitment and withdrawal behaviors from the organization.
right. You've got to curate these things as structurally from the top down. To make sure that you're curating a organization that's worthy of organizational commitment and use those withdrawal signs as kind of it's actually a late indicator. If you're starting to see withdrawal signs, you've failed way, 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 way up the chain, structurally, the training of your managers and those things. So those are late indicators, but if you are seeing them, let that be your warning sign to say, I need to do some reflection and change things here within the organization.
That's absolutely correct. Okay, so I think that wraps up this part 2 of why people quit and how to keep them. If you didn't check out the part 1 of this episode, please do that. And I hope that together, part 1 and part 2, have given some good evidence and some ideas for folks to really do exactly that. Keep the good people in your organization and understand why people quit. Thanks for listening to the Indigo Podcast. If you like this podcast, please consider helping us by rating us on Apple Podcasts or wherever you listen, telling your friends about us, having us on your podcast, or mentioning us on social media. Our website is www.indigopodcast.com, where you can access more information about us and this episode. Thanks again, and we look forward to talking with you again soon.